They laughed when he raised his hand. $10 for a half-wild, battle-scarred black giant no one else would touch. But Elias Mercer wasn't bidding on a horse. He was answering something buried deep inside himself. What he brought home that day wasn't just a broken animal. It was a survivor with secrets carved into its hide and enemies who would do anything to claim it back. No one in Dry Creek could have guessed that $10 bid would set off a storm of blood, betrayal, and redemption. One that would test the meaning of loyalty, family, and freedom itself. The sun bore down like a hammer on Dry Creek, Texas. Noon light seared the hard-packed dirt until it cracked like old porcelain, and the dust hung thick in the air, stirred with every shuffle of a boot and every snort of livestock. The auction yard was little more than a corral of rusted steel and warped wood, but on days like this, it became the beating heart of the county. Farmers and ranchers pressed against the railings, hats pulled low against the glare, sweat darkening the bands around their crowns. The air reeked of hay and horseflesh, of unwashed denim and chewing tobacco, of men who had worked the land all their lives and carried the dust in their paws. On the raised platform at the center, Jonah Pike, the auctioneer, leaned forward, his voice rattling like the gears of a worn-out machine. He was a thin man with a voice that could cut through the roar of cattle, but after an hour of calling lots, even his bark had grown hoarse. "Next lot," he announced, his voice low and unimpressed. "Lot 19. A sound cut across the yard, the scrape of chains dragging over wood. Heads turned. The murmuring crowd leaned forward as a figure emerged from the holding pen. At first, it looked like a shadow had detached itself from the wall. Then it stepped into the light. The horse was enormous, coal-black from ears to hooves. Its back was broad as a wagon tongue, its muscles coiled beneath a coat streaked with mud and sweat. Its head was lowered, but its eyes, one bloodshot red, the other gleaming with wild fire, flashed with a menace that silenced the chatter for half a heartbeat. Its mane was matted, clumped with burrs, and scars lined its flanks like faded maps of violence. A warped board dangled from a chain around its neck, scrolled with paint. Lot 19, $10. The animal shuddered, iron links clanking as it was dragged onto the platform. Its hooves struck the planks with such force that dust leapt into the air. The crowd erupted in laughter. "Hell, that one's fit for dog food," someone jeered. "Look at it, meaner than a drunk mule," another hollered. "You'd be a fool to put a saddle on that beast." A wad of paper arced through the air and bounced off the horse's shoulder. It flinched, teeth bared in a warning snap. A few men whistled, amused at the reaction, while others just shook their heads. Jonah Pike rapped his hammer, impatience clear. He'd seen hopeless stock before. "Lot 19, he called, his tone half-hearted. $10. Do I hear 10? The words hung. No hands rose. The horse pawed at the board, snorting, the sound deep and furious. The crowd edged back a step, as if expecting it to leap the rail. No one bid. Heads shook. And then, from the back row, a voice cut through. 10. The crowd turned. Elias Mercer sat apart from the others, alone at the far end of the benches. His hat brim cast a shadow over his face, but even in the heat haze, the long scar that ran from his temple down the line of his neck caught the light. His shirt was faded, the sleeves rolled to reveal forearms hardened like oak, scarred and corded. His hands, broad, calloused and steady, rested on his knees as though carved from stone. Since coming home from the war, Elias had spoken little to anyone in Dry Creek. He lived on the ragged edge of the county in a ranch that was more ruined than home, fixing fences that never stayed fixed, eating meals alone, listening to a silence that grew heavier with every passing year. Most folks thought he had gone half mad, living with ghosts. Now, with that single word, the silence of his life broke. Jonah blinked, his mouth twisting. $10, he repeated, incredulous. He leaned over his podium, searching Elias's face for some hint of a joke. "I got $10. Do I hear 11? Nothing. The yard erupted in laughter again, cruel and rowdy. "You damn fool, Mercer," one man shouted, "spending money on a death wish. Figures. Always said he weren't right since he came back." Elias didn't flinch. His gaze never left the horse. Jonah raised the hammer again, smirking. "Going once, going twice. Sold to the man in the back. $10. The hammer fell with a sharp crack. The crowd buzzed with ridicule. Mercer's lost his mind. That horse'll kill him before the week's out. Elias stood. The bench creaked under his weight as he walked toward the platform. The crowd parted, murmuring, watching him as though expecting him to back down. He didn't. He reached for the chain at the horse's neck. The horse, though the name Midnight had not yet been spoken, snorted, muscles trembling as it jerked its head back. The chain rattled in Elias's grip, a violent tug nearly yanking it free. But Elias didn't stumble. He held firm, his boots planted deep in the dust, his arm steady. The horse froze, testing the strength of the man holding it. Elias's eyes met its wild gaze, not with fear, but with something older, something hardened on battlefields where bullets had fallen like rain. He whispered nothing, offered no comfort, only stood his ground. After a long heartbeat, the animal's ears twitched. The tension in its neck eased. Its breath still came fast, but the chain slackened. And then, surprisingly, it stepped forward. The laughter behind them dimmed. A ripple of unease replaced the mockery. Elias led the horse from the platform, the chain taut but unbroken. His strides were measured, calm. The horse followed. The murmurs shifted. Son of a... It's walking with him. Maybe Mercer's got more grit than sense. By the time he reached the loading gate, the noise had quieted. Even the loudest mockers stood silent, watching the pair disappear toward the stock trailer. Inside the trailer, the horse shifted uneasily, its bulk rocking the suspension. Elias swung the gate closed, latched it, and stepped around to the cab of his pickup. Dust swirled as the old truck roared to life, coughing smoke before settling into a steady rumble. On the road out of town, heat shimmered above the cracked blacktop. Elias drove without the radio, the only sound the groan of the engine and the occasional thud of hooves against the trailer walls. In the mirror, the black horse stood tall, unmoving, its eyes glowing like embers in the dim light. Elias watched it for a long moment, then spoke a single word, quiet as breath. Midnight. The name seemed to settle in the air between them. He pressed his foot to the gas, and the truck rolled on through the dry land, dust rising in long plumes behind them. The town, with its laughter and doubt, fell away into the distance. Ahead lay only the open road, the ranch that waited, and the beginning of something no one, least of all Elias Mercer, could have seen coming. By the time Elias turned onto the dirt track that led to his ranch, the sun had begun to sink, laying a copper sheen across the brittle fields. He parked in the gravel lot, cut the engine, and sat for a long minute with both hands on the wheel. The house rose in silence behind him, paint peeling, porch sagging, every board steeped in years of neglect. The barn leaned to one side, its doors crooked, hinges rusted through. The horse shifted in the truck bed, chains rattling. Elias got out, boots crunching over the gravel, and unlatched the tailgate. The animal stood tall, sweat streaked down its neck, flanks trembling slightly from the ride. Elias didn't lead it to the barn. He already knew the structure couldn't hold such a beast, not with the weight of its body and the rage bottled inside. Instead, he walked it past the barn toward the old paddock by the oak tree. The fence there had once been painted white, but the boards had long since faded to grey, warped and splintered. He had built it years ago when his son was small, a safe space for ponies and play. It had stood empty ever since. The horse halted at the gate, nostrils flaring, ears twitching. Elias opened it wide and stepped inside, tugging gently on the rope. The horse resisted for a breath, then moved forward, heavy hooves thudding against the earth. Elias unclipped the rope and stepped back, giving it space. The animal turned once in a slow circle, testing the ground, then stopped, black against the fading light. It looked less like a horse and more like some relic from a forgotten war. Elias leaned on the fence, his breath catching in his chest. He'd brought home strays before, dogs, calves, once even a hawk with a broken wing. But nothing like this. There was a weight about the animal, an aura that pressed against him like a memory. That night, the sky clouded over. A pale grey moon broke through now and again, painting the paddock in strips of cold light. The wind slid through the rails with a low whistle. Elias sat on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. His eyes kept dragging back to the paddock. The black horse hadn't lain down, it hadn't even paced. It stood in the center of the pen like a sentinel, head high, ears pricked forward, body rigid as stone. Every so often it turned its gaze outward, scanning the darkness beyond the fence. Elias sipped the bitter coffee. He knew that posture. He had seen it in men crouched on rooftops and fellow soldiers huddled against sandbags, rifles across their knees. The look of someone who didn't believe the night would keep them safe. He rubbed the scar along his jaw, thinking of the ambush outside Fallujah, the night they'd waited for hours, watching the horizon for shapes that never came. Until they did. His voice was little more than a whisper in the still air. "Neither of us sleeps, huh?" The horse flicked an ear but didn't move. The ranch had been silent for years, but never like this. Never with a companion who shared the same restless vigil. By morning, a weak sun crept up over the hills. Elias filled a bucket with water, tossed a flake of hay into the paddock, then returned with an old grooming brush. He climbed through the gate, careful not to startle. Midnight lifted its head, ears swiveling, its eyes followed his every move. Elias walked slow, boots crunching soft against the dirt. The horse snorted, stepped back, muscles tightening. Elias paused, lowered his gaze, held the brush loosely in his hand. "Not here to fight," he muttered. He stopped within arm's length and waited. Minutes ticked by. The horse's breath was harsh, steady. Finally, Elias reached out, dragging the brush lightly across the animal's shoulder. Midnight flinched, skin rippling under the touch, but didn't bolt. Elias held steady, moving slow, letting the bristles scrape dirt from the coat. That was when he saw the marks. A thick white scar circled the base of the neck and chest, smooth as if burned in. The kind of mark a chain left when pulled too tight for too long. Lower down, a long gash traced along the flank, healed but puckered, a wound that had once run deep. There were others too, thin lines, faded welts, stories carved into flesh by hands that knew cruelty better than care. Elias swallowed hard. The war had left its marks on him too. He dropped the brush to his side and simply laid a hand against the horse's neck. The animal stiffened. Then, after a long pause, let out a slow breath. They stood like that, silent, two survivors bound by scars that words could never carry. By afternoon, the air grew warmer. Elias sat on the porch steps when the crunch of tires rolled up the drive. A battered pickup pulled in. Out stepped Clara Duval, carrying a pie tin. Her red hair was tied back in a messy knot, her jeans streaked with mud. She'd been Elias's neighbor for nearly a decade, though neighbor in Dry Creek meant a ranch 3 miles down the road. She walked up the steps without waiting for an invitation. "So it's true," she said, holding out the pie. "You bought yourself a monster for $10. Elias took the tin. "It's not a monster." Clara cocked an eyebrow, glancing toward the paddock where Midnight stood, head high. "Looks like one to me. Folks in town say you finally lost it." Elias didn't flinch. "It's still strong." Her laugh was quick, dry. "Strong enough to tear down that fence, maybe. You planning on rebuilding the whole ranch when it decides to go through those boards?" He didn't answer. His gaze drifted back to the paddock, and Clara followed it, the teasing softening slightly in her expression. "You really think you can fix something like that?" she asked quietly. Elias's jaw tightened. "Maybe it's not the horse that needs fixing." She studied him for a long moment, then shook her head, a half smile returning. "Well, if it kills you, I'll make sure they bury you with your $10 bargain." She turned back toward her truck, calling over her shoulder, "And I expect you to return that pie tin when you're done." The engine coughed to life, tires spitting gravel as she pulled away. Elias sat where he was, the pie untouched beside him. That night, the wind came back. Elias sat on the porch again, rifle propped against the railing. Midnight stood in the paddock exactly where he had the night before, head lifted, body taut, eyes sweeping the horizon as if daring something to approach. He felt it then, not fear, not comfort, but a strange solidarity, as if the ranch was no longer empty. They were 2 sentries now, man and beast, both carved by battles they hadn't asked for. For the first time in years, Elias realized he wasn't watching alone. The next morning began with the crunch of tires on gravel. Elias looked up from mending a loose hinge on the porch gate. A battered pickup truck rolled to a stop. Its paint was sun-bleached, its tailgate dented. The door opened, and a woman in her 40s stepped out, her face wan and tired. She was a distant cousin of Elias's late wife, and she had the look of someone carrying news no one wanted to give. From the passenger side, a girl climbed out. She carried a suitcase almost as big as she was, its plastic wheels scraping against the dirt. 14 years old, small for her age, her face pale, eyes ringed with dark shadows as if she hadn't slept in weeks. She kept her chin tucked, her expression guarded. The woman guided her forward, then stopped at the porch. "Elias," she said softly, "this is Rebecca." The words didn't need more explanation. Elias already knew. Her parents, his wife's younger sister and her husband, had died 2 weeks earlier in a highway crash. There were no other living relatives who could take her in. That left him. He gave a single nod. "Rebecca." The girl looked up briefly, then down again. She tightened her grip on the suitcase handle, knuckles white. "You'll be all right here," the woman said gently, though her voice wavered. She lingered a moment, then sighed, returned to her truck and drove away, leaving only a trail of dust in the hot air. Elias stood on the porch, awkward in his own skin. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't know what to say. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured toward the house. "Come on in." Rebecca dragged her suitcase up the steps, the wheels clattering against the boards. The house had never felt emptier than when Rebecca first walked its halls. She moved slowly, touching nothing, her eyes flicking from the bare walls to the stacks of tools and boxes that cluttered the corners. At lunch, Elias ladled soup into 2 bowls. She sat stiff-backed, staring at the steam curling up from the broth. She took a few slow spoonfuls, then laid the spoon down, appetite gone. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the same silence he'd lived with for years. There was another presence now, fragile and tentative. That afternoon, Rebecca stood on the porch steps, staring toward the paddock. The black horse stood motionless within, as though carved from stone. Midnight was enormous in daylight, muscles gleaming beneath the scars, mane tangled like a storm cloud. She wrapped her arms around herself, eyes locked on the animal. Elias leaned against the porch railing, watching from a distance. He didn't know what she saw in the horse, but the intensity in her gaze made him uneasy. The 2 figures, the girl and the beast, stood facing each other across the yard, neither moving, both bearing the look of creatures who had lost too much, too soon. 2 days later, as dusk settled in, Rebecca drifted closer. Elias was repairing the barn door when he noticed her walking. Small steps across the field toward the paddock fence. The wind lifted her hair, tangling it across her face, but she didn't stop. She stopped at the rails, only a few feet from the horse. Midnight turned its head, ears flicking forward, eyes sharp and watchful. For a moment, Elias tensed, ready to call out, to warn her back. But something in her stance, nervous yet determined, held him silent. Rebecca's voice came softly, carried by the wind. "You're not scary," she whispered. "You just don't want to be alone." The words seemed to still the air. Midnight's ears twitched. The horse didn't rear, didn't snort or stomp. It stood, head tilted slightly, as if listening. The next evening, the impossible happened. Rebecca returned to the paddock. Elias lingered on the porch, pretending to be busy, but watching closely. She stopped again at the fence. Midnight moved closer, each step deliberate, hooves pressing deep prints into the dirt. Rebecca extended her hand, stopping just short of the rails. Her palm trembled, but she didn't pull back. Midnight lowered its head, nostrils flaring. The breath that left its body came out hot, brushing across her fingers. For a suspended moment it stood there, eyes gleaming in the fading light. Then, with surprising gentleness, it touched its muzzle to her open palm. Rebecca let out a shaky breath. Her lips parted in a faint, astonished smile. Elias's chest tightened. He had tried to brush the horse, to touch its hide, and had been met with rigid muscle and barely controlled fury. Yet here was Rebecca, fragile, grieving, a slip of a girl, and the beast had allowed her touch as though it had been waiting for her all along. The sight unsettled him, and at the same time stirred something deep in his chest he hadn't felt in years. That night, after dinner, Elias stepped out onto the porch again. Rebecca sat on the steps, knees pulled up to her chest. She stared out toward the paddock, silent. Midnight stood a short distance from the fence, but its posture was different now. The fire in its eyes had softened, its stance less rigid. It no longer looked like a soldier waiting for attack, but something quieter, something almost peaceful. Elias lowered himself into the chair beside the door. The silence felt less like absence and more like a fragile thread holding them together. He watched her watching the horse, and for the first time since she had arrived, he felt a spark of something he had thought long dead. Hope. Hope that the horse might change. Hope that the girl might heal. Hope that maybe, just maybe, both of them might lead him back toward something like family. But he didn't know that hope was about to be tested in the worst way possible. The next morning broke quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Elias woke before dawn, pulled on his boots, and walked the gravel drive toward the mailbox at the end of the dirt road. The air was crisp, the horizon still painted with a thin red line of rising sun. The mailbox was old, its paint flaked away. He lifted the creaking lid. Bills, flyers, the usual handful of nothing, and then at the bottom a single yellowed envelope. No stamp, no return address. Someone had placed it there by hand. He frowned, pulling it free. The paper was brittle at the edges. He tore it open and unfolded the sheet inside. Scrolled across the page in hurried, crooked letters were 7 words. That blood doesn't belong in your dirt. Elias read the line 3 times. That blood. Not that horse. The words pressed heavier into his chest. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the dirt road, the line of mesquite trees that bordered his property. No movement, no dust cloud of retreating tires, but the feeling crept in anyway. The ranch wasn't as private as he had thought. He folded the letter and slipped it into his shirt pocket. His jaw tightened as he walked back toward the house. Someone knew about the horse, and they knew something more. By midday, Elias drove into town, the old Chevy rattling. The dusty spur was dim inside, the air thick with stale beer and cigarette smoke. Jonah Pike was exactly where Elias expected him, slouched at a corner table, a beer sweating in his hand. Elias walked straight over and dropped the envelope onto the table. It landed with a flat slap. Jonah blinked at it, then looked up at Elias. "Explain," Elias said. Jonah shifted, his fingers tightening around the glass. "Ain't my handwriting." "I didn't ask whose hand," Elias said, his voice low but sharp. "I asked for an explanation." The silence stretched. Jonah's eyes flicked to the envelope, then away. "You don't want to know," he muttered. Elias leaned forward, his scarred hand closing around Jonah's beer, pressing it harder against the table. The liquid sloshed. "Tell me." Jonah swallowed. Finally, the words spilled out, quick and reluctant. "That horse. It wasn't supposed to be there, wasn't supposed to make it to auction at all." Elias's jaw worked. "Go on." "New Mexico," Jonah said. "Federal seizure. They raided a place out there, a breeding camp. Nothing legal about it. Horses chained, starved, some pumped with drugs, some bred for strength, speed, stamina. Used them for fighting, for running goods across the border, even for damned dogfights. Midnight, that horse, was part of the lot. Mean bastard, near died in chains. They said no one should touch him, safer to put him down." Jonah rubbed a hand across his jaw, his voice dropping lower. But someone with deep pockets came sniffing around. Paid cash under the table, greased the right palms. Papers disappeared. Next thing I know, he shows up on my roster. Lot 19. I didn't ask questions. I don't want to know whose pocket it came from. Elias's stare didn't waver. "Who?" Jonah shook his head fast. "Don't drag me into it. Whoever's behind that horse, they don't leave loose ends. You keep it, Mercer. You paint a target on your back. That horse ain't just trouble. It's bait." Elias straightened, the envelope still resting between them. He left it there, turned, and walked out without another word. The ride back to the ranch was long and silent. He had gone into that auction blind, thinking $10 bought him a broken animal. Instead, it felt like he had stepped straight into the middle of a trap. That afternoon, Elias headed for the old storage shed at the far edge of the property. The door groaned as he forced it open, dust swirling into the light. The place smelled of oil and mildew. He dug through stacked boxes, papers yellowed with age, tools rusted in their drawers. Dust clung to his throat as he pried open an old carton marked with his name. Inside, folders of military paperwork, folded uniforms, medals he hadn't looked at in years. He rifled through the stack until a photograph slid free. He froze, breath caught in his chest. The picture showed him younger, cleaner shaven, standing shoulder to shoulder with men he hadn't spoken to since deployment. Behind them loomed a black horse, broad and muscled, its eyes hard as stone. Across its shoulder ran a faint, pale mark, a scar shaped like a crescent moon. Elias's pulse quickened. He knew that mark. He had brushed it just yesterday on midnight. He sank onto an overturned crate, the photo trembling in his hands. The past he thought was buried was staring back at him in ink and shadow. That evening, Elias carried the photograph out to the paddock. He stood at the fence, holding it against the rail, his eyes shifting between the faded image and the living beast before him. Midnight turned slowly, lifting its head as though aware of the scrutiny. The resemblance was undeniable. The build, the height, the fire in the eyes. It wasn't the exact same horse. Years had passed, too many to account for, but the bloodline, the lineage. The scar on the shoulder matched. The rough cut of muscle, the way it moved even standing still, carried echoes of military breeding. Horses built for war, engineered for endurance, for carrying men and gear into hell and back. Midnight wasn't just a stray, it was something bred for battle, a living weapon, and someone wanted it back. That night he sat on the porch, the anonymous letter lying on the table beside his coffee mug, the old photograph clenched in his hand. The moon was high, silver against the black sky. Rebecca stepped out quietly, her hair tangled from sleep. She padded across the porch and sank onto the step beside him. "Is it true?" she asked softly. "Do you think Midnight was a soldier's horse?" Elias didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the paddock, where Midnight stood tall in the moonlight, unmoving, ears pricked like a sentry. Finally, he gave a small nod. "If he is, then he's lived through worse than we can imagine." Rebecca hugged her knees, silent. She didn't look afraid, she looked thoughtful, as though the horse's scars mirrored her own. Elias leaned back, the old boards creaking beneath him. He had fought his battles overseas, but this felt different. The war wasn't behind him anymore. It was here, clawing its way back through the life he had tried to rebuild. He glanced at the letter, the photograph, then at the horse keeping its vigil in the dark. Keeping Midnight meant stepping into another fight, one he hadn't chosen, but one he couldn't walk away from. And deep down, Elias knew he wasn't about to let go. The ranch had been quiet for days, too quiet. Elias almost let himself believe the letter had been nothing more than a warning tossed on the wind, that maybe whoever wanted the horse back had given up. But old instincts never lied. Quiet nights didn't mean safety. They meant something was waiting. It was late, the moon hanging low and pale, when Elias grabbed his lantern and walked toward the paddock for one last check. The boards of the porch creaked under his boots, the grass whispering with each step. As he neared the fence, something in the air felt wrong. The shadows stretched longer than they should. A faint metallic glint caught his eye near the latch. He stopped cold. The padlock that had secured the gate lay on the ground, cut clean through. Not broken, not pried. Cut with precision. His chest tightened. Midnight stood pressed into the far corner of the paddock, flanks quivering, breath heavy. Sweat shone on its coat, and its massive body trembled in the dim light. Then Elias saw it. A fresh wound carved into the horse's left side, a long gash oozing bright red into the black hair. "Damn it," Elias muttered, his fists clenching. His pulse thundered in his ears. Someone had been here, someone had crept onto his land, into his life, and left their mark. Behind him, quick footsteps scuffed across the porch. Rebecca's voice cracked through the dark. "Uncle Elias, what?" She stopped when she saw it. Her breath hitched and then broke into a sob. She ran to the fence, clutching at the wood with white-knuckled fingers. "Who did this?" she cried, tears streaking her cheeks. "He's bleeding. He's bleeding so much. Midnight lifted its head, gave a short, guttural cry, then stood still, as though trying not to frighten the girl further. Rebecca stretched a trembling hand through the slats, her fingers brushing the horse's neck. "Easy," she whispered, though her own voice was shaking. "You're okay. You're okay." Elias crouched beside the wound, pulling a clean rag from his pocket and a bottle of salt water he'd brought from the house. His hands moved quick but careful, dabbing away blood and dirt. Midnight flinched but did not lash out. The lantern light cast them in stark relief: an old soldier with a clenched jaw, a giant horse trembling with pain, and a girl, small and fragile, crying but unflinching at its side. Something inside Elias burned, not just anger, the heavy, suffocating sense that he had failed them both. He stood, rag-soaked crimson, chest heaving. "Cowards," he muttered under his breath, more growl than words. "Bastards can't even face me. They creep in the dark and cut what can't fight back." The night pressed closer. Elias scanned the horizon, his hand twitching toward the memory of his rifle. Tonight every instinct screamed. He was already under siege. For a long moment he considered calling the sheriff, but doubt settled in his gut. He knew how things worked. By the time the paperwork was filed, the threat would be deeper, sharper, already at his throat. And Rebecca? No, he couldn't risk her being dragged into it. The system wouldn't save them. He had learned that in another desert, half a world away. By midnight, after pacing the porch, Elias gave in. He went inside, lifted the receiver from the phone, and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The line clicked. A voice, gravelly and low, answered. "Deputy Harris Cole." "It's me," Elias said. A pause, then recognition. "Mercer, didn't expect to hear from you this side of Judgment Day." Elias's tone was steady, but his grip on the receiver was iron. "I've got trouble. Someone came onto the ranch tonight, cut my lock, cut the horse. I think they'll be back." Harris exhaled slow. "Stay put. I'll be there." The sound of an engine announced him half an hour later. Headlights swept across the yard. A pickup rolled to a stop, and Harris Cole climbed out, moving with the slow heaviness of a man carrying too many years. His sheriff's jacket was faded, his hat pulled low. They clasped hands briefly, then Harris moved toward the paddock, his flashlight beam cutting across Midnight's side, stopping at the fresh wound. His brows knit. "Not deep," he muttered. "Not meant to kill." He looked back at Elias. This was a message. Elias's jaw tightened. "Message received, but I'm not sending him back." Harris studied him a long moment, then sighed. "Thought you'd say that." They walked the perimeter, his boots crunching against the gravel. When they returned to the porch, Harris leaned against the rail and lit a cigarette. "You need to hear this straight," Harris said, smoke curling from his mouth. "This isn't kids with knives. The man behind this is Caleb Voss." Elias didn't react, but the name dropped heavy in the air. "Voss runs half the underworld in 3 counties, Harris went on. "Horse fights, illegal breeding, smuggling rings. He's ruthless, Mercer, always has been. That black giant in your yard, it's not just some stray, it's evidence. Proof of what he's doing. He won't let it stay alive in your hands. So he comes here in the dark and takes his shots at me through the horse. He'll do worse," Harris said flatly. "He doesn't care about you, but if you stand in his way—" He flicked ash into the dirt. "You'll be marked. You'll be a target until one of you is buried." Rebecca had stayed quiet during the talk, crouched beside Midnight, gently wiping the wound. The horse stood still for her, calmer than Elias had ever seen it. His gaze lingered on her, then returned to Harris. His eyes were cold, unyielding. "I'm not giving him up," Elias said. The words came out steady, final. "Not to Voss, not to anyone." Harris stared hard at him, then slowly nodded. "You haven't changed. Still the same stubborn son of a—" "I knew in uniform." He tapped the cigarette against the railing. "All right then, listen. Reinforce your fences. Watch your back, keep the girl close, and for God's sake, be ready for nights worse than this one." When Harris finally drove off, silence reclaimed the ranch. But it wasn't peace. It was the silence before thunder, thick and heavy, waiting to break. Elias sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap. In the paddock, Midnight stood like a sentinel. Rebecca leaned against its side, her head resting against the broad muscle of its shoulder. The three of them, man, girl, horse, bound together in the quiet. Danger was no longer far away. It was here, and it was only getting closer. The blanket was too small for the chill that clung to the ground, but Rebecca dragged it anyway, the corners collecting grass seeds and burrs as she hauled it across the yard. She didn't ask permission. She just kept walking toward the paddock under the thin wash of moonlight, determined in the quiet way only the newly brave can be. Elias watched from the steps while Rebecca spread the blanket near the corner post, right up against the lower rail. She sat, knees to her chest, back against the rough wood, facing the black horse that towered on the other side. Midnight moved closer, the great head lowered, breath rolling out warm and heavy, stirring strands of the girl's hair. Rebecca looked back toward the house where Elias stood. Her voice carried without effort. "He won't leave me," she said, steady though her hands shook. "He won't leave me, and I won't leave him." Elias only nodded once, an old soldier's nod that acknowledges both danger and duty. He stepped down from the porch, crossed the yard, and crouched to adjust the blanket so the splinters on the post wouldn't catch it. Midnight's breath brushed his knuckles. "You can sleep inside," he said, gently as he could make it. "I'll sit the porch." "I'm not sleeping," she replied. "I'm staying." Then softer, to the horse, "We're staying." Midnight's muzzle hovered over her crown. He simply breathed, a slow bellows in the cool air, as if mapping the shape of the girl's scent into something he recognized as home. Elias felt the weight of that intimacy settle into him. He returned to the porch and set the rifle across his lap. The night had its own rules. There were nights when the world hummed with creatures, and there were nights when that choir fell silent, the hush turning solid as if the dark itself were holding its breath. Tonight, the ranch held its breath. No cricket sang, no neighbor's hound barked. The quiet wrapped around the house and the pen, and the three of them like a film of ice. Elias watched the paddock for hours, measuring the shape of shadows with the patience of a watchman. Near midnight, an itch moved under his skin. The old warning. His shoulders stiffened. A glow flickered beyond the cottonwoods at the end of the long dirt drive. Headlights. They slid along the trunks and reached into the yard, washing the fence posts in cold brilliance, then vanished as the vehicle turned. Elias was already on his feet. The engine's growl arrived a breath later, low and throaty. The porch light caught on the rifle as he raised it, the stock nestled against his shoulder. He didn't call out to Rebecca. She felt the shift and was already up on one knee. Midnight tossed his head once, then planted his hooves, digging into the hard dirt. The beams combed the pasture and then swung inward, flooding the yard with a hard glare. The truck rolled the last 20 yards like a shark gliding into shoal water. No hurry. It came to a stop where the drive widened. The engine idled, then cut. Silence fell, deeper than before, pierced only by midnight's huff. A door opened with a precise click. A figure unfolded from the cab, tall and broad in the shoulders, the brim of a hat cutting his face in shadow. He took his time. Caleb Voss stepped into the spill of moonlight the way one steps onto a stage they own. Elias kept the rifle leveled. Voss paused 10 feet from the porch steps. His boots were expensive, his coat hung open to show a belt buckle polished like a mirror. He didn't look at Elias first. He looked at the paddock. Midnight's ears flattened, the massive head tracking every shift of Voss's weight. When Voss finally turned his face to Elias, he didn't smile. His voice came low and sounded smooth. "That horse is property. It doesn't belong to you." Rebecca's fingers tightened on the rail. Elias didn't blink. "It belongs to freedom." Voss tipped his head a fraction. "You think you can keep it free?" His glance slid along the fence line, the patched rails, the places where the night still showed the scar of the cut lock. "You think you can keep anything free out here?" Midnight let out a low growl of a sound. The girl swallowed and pressed her shoulder to the post. Her silence was an act of will. Elias lifted the rifle a few inches higher. "I kept my men alive in places where the ground tried to swallow us and the sky spit fire. Keeping a horse on my own land is simpler." Voss moved one step closer, hands visible, empty. "A horse like that carries more than muscle, soldier. It carries history, Papers go missing, names get brushed off, but blood keeps its books. That animal's blood is a ledger, and I don't like open ledgers." He paused. "Return what isn't yours, and the night stays quiet. Keep it, and noise comes, the kind that doesn't stop." Midnight pressed one forehoof into the dirt, carving a half-moon groove. Elias thought of the scar in the old photograph, of the cut on Midnight's side, of Rebecca's small palm pressed there as if faith alone could close it. The heat in his chest shifted from ember to steady coal. "You don't scare me," Elias said. It came out plain, almost conversational. "Not because you're not the kind of man who can break things. I know you are. But because I've seen the inside of what happens when men like you think you own everything you touch. It ends the same way every time, with something feral refusing to bow." Voss studied him. A muscle jumped once in his jaw. "You've got a girl hanging off that fence," he said finally, his gaze cutting toward Rebecca. "You've got an old house and a tired gate and a patch of land the bank could sneeze at. What you don't have is an army." "I have enough," Elias said. "That's what men say right before their luck ends." Midnight's head dropped until his muzzle hovered inches from the top rail. The horse exhaled. The sound rolled across the yard like a blacksmith's bellows. The stalemate lasted longer than it should have. Then Voss made a small sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so empty. He stepped back one careful pace and turned. Gravel chewed under his boots as he walked to the truck. He climbed in, shut the door, and turned the key. The engine roared. The headlights came alive and swept the porch, throwing Elias's shadow long and thin across the clapboards. For a heartbeat, Voss sat with the lights pinned on the house and the paddock as if taking one last photograph. Then he swung the truck in a slow arc and headed down the drive. When the sound faded, silence came back in like tidewater, heavy and briny. This one had weight. Elias lowered the rifle. He didn't put it away. He looked toward the paddock. Rebecca hadn't moved. Her face was pale, but she wasn't shaking. Midnight stood right behind her, a massive wall at her back. "You all right?" Elias asked. She nodded once. "He didn't scare me," she said. It sounded half true, which is sometimes the truest bravery there is. Elias crossed the yard to them. He set his hand on the top board and felt the echo of Midnight's breath in the grain. "That man will be back," he said. Rebecca didn't look away from the field. "So will we." Elias stepped into the pen, slow and deliberate. Midnight watched him come. Elias put his palm against the horse's neck. The heat there beat against his hand, steady and heavy. Midnight leaned a fraction into the contact. "We hold," Elias said, not sure whether he spoke to the horse, the girl, or himself. "We hold, and if they come, we make them regret the distance they drove." The moon sailed west. The scar on Midnight's shoulder was a pale crescent. In another life, Elias had learned that time doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it loops back, offering you a second chance to stand where you should have stood the first time. He went to the porch long enough to fetch a second blanket and settled it around Rebecca's shoulders. "Try to rest," Elias said. She shook her head, but laid her cheek against the wood. "I'm resting here," she whispered. "With him." Elias took up his station on the porch again, rifle across his lap, eyes on the dark. The quiet breathed in and out. There was something new set into the foundation of the ranch now, something that felt like a vow. He had not chosen this war, but the war had chosen him. "Let them come," Elias said into the night, soft enough that only the oak and the horse could hear him. Midnight lifted his head and looked toward the road. The ranch exhaled, not in relief, but in readiness. The sky held, the fence held, and Elias held too. A man in a chair with a rifle and a promise, keeping watch until the shape of dawn began at last to gather on the rim of the world. The next night arrived with an edge. Wind hammered the grass flat and drove sand against the porch rails. A lid of clouds slid over the moon until the world went black as coal. Elias sat with the rifle across his thighs, a knot lodged under his breastbone. On the far side of the yard, the paddock was a darker square within the dark. Somewhere inside it, Midnight breathed like a bellows, steady and ready. The first sound was not a footstep. It was the bone-deep crack of timber giving way. Elias was on his feet before the splinters finished flying. The paddock gate burst inward. Two boards kicked free like toothpicks, and a shape as big as a doorframe surged and bucked inside the chaos. Midnight, squealing a battle cry that made the earth jump. "Rebecca, inside!" Elias shouted, but she was already at the doorway, eyes wide, hand clutching the frame. The beams of two flashlights snapped on, carving white stripes through the yard. They chopped the dark into stuttering pieces: fence, oak, rail, muscle, rope, then landed on two men in masks, vaulting the broken rails. One held a coil of rope, the kind that could pull an engine block from a truck. The other swung a steel bar that caught a shard of starlight and threw it into Elias's eyes. They split without speaking, moving in the quick, practiced wedge of men who'd done this while other houses slept. Ropeman drove straight for Midnight's head, the lariat already singing in the air. Steel bar peeled right, angling for the flank, a strike meant to fold anything with a spine. Elias ran. He crossed the yard in long, hard strides, the rifle bumping against his palm. He glanced once at the porch, Rebecca still there, white-knuckled and rooted, and angled his path to keep himself between her and the men. The rope snapped forward and met a wall of animal that refused the script. Midnight lunged into it. The big chest slammed Ropeman so hard his boots left the ground. He hit the dirt and skidded, the lariat snarling around his legs, his flashlight spinning into the weeds. Steel bar hesitated one beat. It was all Midnight needed. The horse kicked. Both hind feet fired like pistons. The bar clanged against a post, buzzing with the force of the blow that missed. "Uncle Elias!" Rebecca's voice cut through the uproar. "Stay back!" he barked. Steel bar recovered and came at Elias with the bar low, scything for his knees. Elias feinted left, felt the wind of the swing whistle past his thigh, then drove a shoulder into the man's ribs. They went down in a tangle, the steel bar ripping the back of Elias's shirt as it tore loose. The rifle clattered away, skidding under the bottom rail. They rolled in the dark. A knee tried for Elias's kidney. He turned, took it on the hip, and answered with a short hook that caught cheekbone. The man's head snapped sideways, the bar raised again. Elias trapped the wrist with both hands and yanked. A twist, a pivot, a takedown. The bar came free. Elias hurled it across the yard where it landed and vanished. The ropeman was up again, limping. He hurled the lariat. It looped over Midnight's ears and caught the jawline. Good throw, but Midnight reared, front hooves tearing chunks out of the air. The rope went taut. The man dug in, trying to lever strength with grit and angle. He might as well have tried to tow a storm. Midnight came down, not on the rope, not on empty ground, but on the man's courage. The hooves hit close, thudding the dirt in a rhythm that said, "Go, or I'll make you." He went. He tripped, rolled, and lost the rope. Rebecca bolted off the porch. "Clara, call the sheriff!" She screamed toward the road. Clara had heard the first crack and driven like a fuse on fire. Her truck fishtailed into the yard now, and she leapt out, ran through the door, and snatched the landline. "Dry Creek Sheriff, it's Clara Duval at the Mercer place. Men on the property armed. Hurry!" Out in the paddock, Rebecca snatched up one of the fallen torches and stabbed the light straight into Ropeman's eyes. He reeled, blinded, as Midnight surged again, head low, ears flat, the radius of his rage widening like a shockwave. "Don't touch him!" she cried, tears cutting tracks down her cheeks. Steel bar lunged at Elias with empty hands now, grabbing for a throat. Elias knocked one arm aside, caught the other, and drove a hard elbow into the hinge where jaw meets ear. The man's legs buckled, and Elias followed him down, pinning his wrist and neck. The fight pressed the breath out of both of them, and then, like a storm's first siren, came the sound Rebecca and Clara had begged the night to carry. The howl of a cruiser. It rose and fell, slicing the fields open with red and blue. Headlights swept the yard, gravel exploded under tires. Deputy Harris Cole stepped out before the engine fully died, gun up, his voice whipping the scene into shape. "Hands where I can see them. Dry Creek Sheriff's Office. Hands up now." Ropeman popped to his feet and ran. Harris fired a single warning shot into the air. The world flinched and froze. The runner stumbled, then vanished into the trees beyond the fence. Steel bar twisted under Elias and tried to bolt. Elias held one wrist until Harris arrived and stamped a boot down on the other. "Don't," Harris said. The man stopped. Across the road, beyond the spill of cruiser lights, an engine turned over. Elias lifted his head and saw through the dust the smooth outline of a truck he knew too well, Caleb Voss's. It had been parked just far enough away. The truck idled for a heartbeat, then fishtailed on gravel and was gone. Elias watched the taillights shrink and knew this wasn't retreat. It was scheduling. Next time, Harris said, following his gaze, he'll bring worse. Elias let go, and Harris snapped cuffs on the man. On your knees, he ordered. The blue-red strobes pulsed against the oak and the broken gate. Sulphur hung in the air. Midnight stood in the trampled pen, chest heaving, foam and sweat, and the copper stink of adrenaline threading his mane. He looked like something carved out of night. Rebecca threw her arms around his neck and sobbed into his hide. It's okay, she whispered, every syllable an oath. You're okay. You're safe. Midnight lowered his head until his jaw rested lightly on her shoulder. The giant seemed to breathe through her. Harris came to Elias and put a hand on his shoulder. You just opened a bigger door than the one they kicked, he said. But tonight you held. Elias nodded once. His eyes never left the girl and the horse. We're not giving him back, he said, and there was nothing in the words to negotiate with. Didn't figure you would, Harris said. The war had only just started. They didn't sleep. Harris made a slow circle of the yard with 2 more units that rolled up. Statements were taken. The cuffed man stared at the ground and said nothing. The kind of silence that comes from fear of a boss, not loyalty to a cause. Eventually the cruisers left. Harris stayed. He and Elias sat on the porch with their mugs like props, both cold to the touch. Clara hovered in the doorway, face fierce with residual adrenaline. Rebecca refused to go inside. She bedded down on the porch boards with a blanket, her head against Midnight's shoulder through the broken rail. Harris spoke when the sky began to pale. You wanted the whole of it, he said. Here it is. He told what he could prove and what he could only say out loud, because the night was almost morning. The horse in their yard was not just a survivor of a New Mexico seizure. He was descended from a line developed years back in a military program that had been shelved, boxed, and buried. The project had aimed to breed what men had always wanted from horses: more lung, more bone, more will. When budgets changed and commanders turned over, papers vanished. Mares and studs were left on a slope between government and private hands. That slope slanted toward men like Caleb Voss. Like finding a rare cartridge no one wants to admit was ever manufactured, Harris said, rubbing the line between his brows. You can drop the labels. The casing still fits, and the powder still burns. He nodded toward the paddock. Voss took what he could, used it where money listens. Fights, runs, hauling for people who know exactly how fast and how quiet an animal can cross a fence line. Your horse is proof. That makes him valuable and dangerous. Dangerous to who? Clara asked, voice edged. To anyone who lives close to the truth, Harris answered. Elias stared into the yard. Midnight stood statuesque, ears flicking at the first birds daring to sing. Rebecca, still nested in the blanket, had one hand sleeping on the rail, palm open as if cupping a little light. He's not just muscle, Elias said at last. He wasn't sure if he meant Midnight or the story, maybe both. Neither are you, Harris said, and that closed the night. After Harris left with promises and caveats, silence settled again, but it no longer had the shape of fear. It had the shape of a threshold. Sun carried gold into the yard, slow and certain. The ranch inhaled. A breeze ran its hand across the fence and made a soft sound like, "Welcome back." Rebecca woke with a start, blinked, and then smiled so quickly it stung Elias's eyes. She stood, stretched, and looked to him for permission he didn't have words for. "Let's see," he said, and went to the tack room. He chose the lightest saddle he owned, old and supple. When he brought it to the paddock, Rebecca was already at the gate, waiting. Midnight watched them come, as if he'd known the morning's plan before they did. Slow, Elias said. No sudden, no loud. They worked in a whisper of motions. Touch the shoulder, step away, return, lift the saddle, rest the leather against the withers without weight. Midnight's skin twitched, then quieted. The girth slid under the belly. They cinched it snug, not tight. All the while, the big horse breathed through the work like a man accepting a bandage, suspicious, then resigned, then grateful. When the saddle settled into place, Rebecca set her palm on it and looked to Elias again. He made a small motion. Go ahead. She put a foot in the stirrup and found the swing in a single smooth arc that seemed to carry her over a line no one else could see. She didn't seat heavy. She perched, balanced, shoulders loose, hands light. Elias stepped back and gave them space. Easy, he cautioned, but the word came with no fear in it. Midnight took the first step like a question, the second like an answer. By the third, he was walking a tidy circle, Rebecca's heels low, and her smile breaking into something that looked like a sky clearing. Clara appeared at Elias's elbow, quiet. She nudged him with her shoulder and nodded toward the rider. She looks like her mama, she said. The words landed soft and heavy at once. Elias swallowed. I know, he said, and the feel of knowing was both ache and balm. They watched as Rebecca widened the circle. The wind found her hair and lifted it into a bright, tangled flag. Midnight's ears flicked back, forward, back, listening, choosing, then settled forward, intent on the simple geometry of a pasture cut by morning light. Rebecca laughed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild. It was the kind of laugh that arrives when grief has had its turn and decides for a little while to let someone else speak. Midnight answered with a long, rolling whinny that traveled out to the fence line and bounced back from the oak. The sound braided itself with the birds, with the low hush of the grass, with the memory of men Elias had known who had promised to come home, and the few who had. Clara touched his hand. He realized he was gripping something and looked down to find the old bridle she'd brought, the leather darkened by years and oil. Clara had carried it in a small wooden box. Not everything's gone, she'd said when she handed it to him. Some things just wait to be found again. He closed his fingers around it now. The past was not a door to slam. It was a bridge, if you were careful. Rebecca guided Midnight toward them and halted without tugging. The horse stood as if the earth and he had made a pact. Elias stepped to the saddle and laid one hand on Rebecca's ankle, the way his father had once done for him. I'm here. You're steady. Keep going. She lowered her head and grinned at him, dirt on her cheek like war paint. He likes it, she said. He likes you, Elias corrected. Rebecca's gaze softened. Elias laughed then, quietly, the sound so out of practice it surprised him. He looked across the ranch, the mended place in the fence, the track marks from Harris's cruiser already softening under the wind, then back to the pair in front of him. Girl and horse, both loosely stitched back together by stubbornness, by luck, by the kind of love that doesn't need applause. He stood beside Clara, the leather of the bridle warming in his grip, and let the realization settle. The ranch wasn't a museum to loss. It was a place where something could start again. He didn't have to rehearse the sentence in his mind. It rose clean and simple. For the first time in years, I am not running. I am standing where I belong. Rebecca nudged Midnight into another slow circuit, and Elias walked with them from inside the circle, his hand brushing the top rail. The morning widened. The gold on the grass brightened. The wind smelled like dust and hay, and a day no one had lived yet. Clara leaned close and said, You've got a family here, Elias Mercer, however you ended up with it. He didn't take his eyes off the rider when he answered. I know. He lifted the bridle and rested it over the rail, the old leather catching a seam of sunlight and glowing like dark honey. He could put it on later. There was no rush. Not everything had to be grabbed and fastened and controlled. Some things could be invited and trusted and met where they stood. Midnight breathed. Rebecca laughed again. The ranch listened. And finally, it believed. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content.